But you notice the treat we have for our audience here, our matching outfits.
Robin, do you remember how we said we weren't going to say anything about it? That's what it is to be cool, is you
Oh,
just
I
don't
see.
say anything. Now it's not cool. Now
I
it's the
see.
opposite of cool.
Well, then let's just lean into the opposite
We
of
had a
cool and
whole
continue.
conversation about how we were not going to
Okay,
mention.
well, we're going to continue in our opposite of cool theme here and just make a whole event out of it. Is that possible?
Speak for yourself, Robin.
Okay.
Okay. Go, you start.
All
You're
right.
the
So
leader.
I'm going to try to be Socratic and ask questions. But we're not assuming that our audience knows everything about this book. So we're discussing your book, Open Socrates, here. And I thought I would start with some quotes. So they're a little redundant in the fact they say similar things, but that will be fine for this audience, many of which doesn't, know what the book is entirely about. And I'm trying to give a, feel for the main sort of high-level claims of the book. And then I have some questions after that. So, and of course, so the very beginning of the book, you start off saying, there's a question you are avoiding. Even now, as you read this sentence, you're avoiding it. And the question is, why am I doing any of this? Which you eventually call an untimely question. And you said you appear to be afraid of
Coming
something.
up behind. Oh, okay.
Socrates' claim is, given that we cannot lead lives based on knowledge because we lack it, we should lead the second best kind of life, namely the one oriented toward knowledge. And then in this book, I aim to reintroduce Socratic ethics. Socratic ethics offers concrete practical guidance. It tells you that you should live a philosophical life and helps you to see how to do so. Then you have this key section. Academic philosophers are, in my experience, eager to show that one can live a perfectly happy and fulfilled life without ever engaging in philosophy. They are also careful to shield the rest of their lives from their philosophical activities. They would readily admit to taking off their philosophical hat when walking into their homes, when socializing with friends, even friends who are philosophers, and more generally, when things get serious. The message is, do philosophy, but don't overdo it. When it comes to the question of how to live our lives, we're already being intellectual and critical and thoughtful enough. This book is an argument to the contrary. In part 3 of the book, which I'm going to focus on more in my questions, we examine that method's demands in 3 areas of life that Socrates thought our ignorance loomed the largest: politics, love, and death. Socratic ethics is the ethics of living a truly philosophical life, and it tells you that the way you should conduct yourself in each of these 3 domains is inquisitively. Virtue is identical to, which is to say, we've got some other people, I guess, who should mute themselves. Until you're ready to
Looks like
speak.
everyone's muted, so I don't know what that
We're
is.
hearing something from somebody.
Yes.
Virtue is identical to, which is to say nothing more than knowledge. If knowledge is the end all and be all, then we should expect the activity that is directed at knowledge, philosophical inquiry, to be how a person develops courage, justice, moderation, and so on. Socrates unified domains as distinct as love, death, and politics, not by analyzing them in terms of some underlying common denominator, but rather seeing them as converging upward toward a single aspiration, inquiry into untimely questions. So a little redundant there, but I hope everyone gets the idea. So you're saying basically...
Doubt that reading quotes from a book is the easiest way to give someone an idea of what the book is about. I'm just going to register that. Go on.
Okay. Oh, I mean, do you want to give another few sentences of summary that are
Sure,
better
I
than what
can
I
say
gave?
what the book is about. The book is an argument for Socratic intellectualism, which is meant as a contender. Sorry, I have to keep admitting people as well. As a contender as against the standard set of ethical theories, which is like Kantianism, utilitarianism, and Aristotelian virtue ethics. And I'm putting forward like a new contender, a new form of ethics that you could be using to live your life. And it is a form of ethics that says that the goal of life is knowledge. So that you should conduct yourself in every part of your life as though what you really wanted was knowledge. I frame it by sort of suggesting that on some level, you already know that this is what you're supposed to do. You're walking through life with a kind of vague, uneasy feeling like there's questions you should be thinking about, but you're not thinking about. And the reason why you avoid these questions is that you have sort of a premonition, let's say, that if you were to try to tackle them, it wouldn't go anywhere. And you would just end up kind of talking in circles, thinking in circles. And this actually happened to Tolstoy. So I opened the book by talking about Tolstoy, who had these fundamental questions that he was thinking about his life, like, why should I be a writer? What's good about being a writer? Why should I care about bringing up my children or the welfare of the peasants, or what's going to become of my whole life given that I'm going to die? He had sort of pushed these questions aside for most of his life, but he turned 50 and he's like, all right, it's time to confront these questions. But the minute he tries to confront them, he's like, oh no, they're impossible. I'll never get anywhere with them. And then he becomes suicidal. And he's like, if you take my advice, just stay away. It's basically the kind of moral of the story. He eventually, he doesn't commit suicide. He eventually sort of finds a kind of salvation in religious faith that allows him to put the questions aside. But still, there's this kind of threat of like, can you actually pursue knowledge? Can you make progress intellectually on fundamental questions? Is that even a thing that people can do? And what I argue is that Socrates, the basis of this new ethical theory, that's this contender, this distinct ethical theory, is Socrates' discovery that actually you can. Tolstoy was wrong, that you can't make any progress. He was right about one thing: you can't make any progress by yourself. But you can make progress with other people by talking about these questions with them. And the reason why you can't do it by yourself is that you think you already have the answers, basically. These are all the questions you think you've already answered. You think you've already answered everything about the meaning of life. You must know what the meaning of life is because you're living, because you're doing stuff. And so when you try to ask yourself the question, you end up basically pretending you're asking. Like I could say, what is 2 + 2? And I can inflect my voice at the end as though it was a question, but I can't really ask it because I think I know what it is. And the same thing is true about these untimely questions. So we can't really pursue them on our own because we think we already have answers. What makes them untimely is that the questions come after the answers. They come at the wrong time. It's supposed to go question and answer. That's the right order. The wrong order is answer question, but untimely questions, it's answer question, because we have to act on these answers before we do any kind of inquiry. That makes inquiry seem foreclosed or impossible. Socrates was like, it's not, you just need help. The middle part of the book sort of explains why, with help, we actually can do this. And then the last part of the book is trying to explain, okay, what is this really in ethics? Does it really give you guidance? Let's look at the guidance that it gives you in 3 areas: love, death, and politics.
All right, thank you. So again, I'm going to try to be Socratic in asking questions. So my first question is to try to distinguish different versions of what this pursuit of knowledge or inquiry could be. So one version could be the good thing or the virtuous thing is the act of inquiring, sort of the stance or activity or effort in inquiring. A second could be that the good is the insights, the things that we actually figure out. And a third would be that the good is the changes in our behavior that can be enabled by knowing more about what's good or whatever we've inquired into. So those are 3 closely related things, but which is the good there?
I think that it's mostly 2. It's mostly the insights, but maybe 2 and 3 are a bit inextricable from a Socratic point of view, because having an understanding of why a certain way to behave is a good way to behave, even if it doesn't change what you would have done, like even if you would have done the same thing without the understanding, the insight is valuable not only because you have like a little intellectual epiphany, somewhere, but because by understanding why you're doing what you're doing, you make that doing your own, like you really did it. And consider an analogy. Imagine if you were offered, thought experiment, someone offers you the whole rest of your life can go on exactly as it would have with one following change: you will not be conscious anymore for the rest of your life. No one will be able to tell that you're not conscious because you're going to be able to have the same facial expressions. You're going to move in the same ways. You're going to make all the same choices. You're just not going to be aware of any of it. There's not going to be anybody in there. So it's basically you have a choice between 2 futures: normal future and zombie future. Which do you want? Which life do you want? Do you want the normal future life or the zombie future life? Most people are going to choose normal future. They're going to say, I don't want zombie future. Why not? Your behavior isn't any different in zombie future. Well, they're like, yeah, but in zombie future, I'm not me. I don't actually live my life. There is no life there. Socrates thought a very similar point applies to the life without knowledge. The life where you don't know why you're doing what you're doing. You're kind of moving around, you're doing stuff, and you're conscious, but it's not really, what you do is not really coming from you. It's not really yours. And so the insights, in a way, they kind of glue the behavior to you, such that the things that you do for the first time become your actions.
If much of the value is in how it changes our behavior, even if we want to stipulate that we also need to understand why we're doing so, that gives some sense of the relative weight of topics and their importance for this metric. That is, not only do we need to value inquiry, but we have to decide which inquiries count more than others. And if the value is for our actions, then we could say, for example, the inquiry just before we die isn't worth so much because it can't influence much behavior. Or inquiry on topics we can't act on are also not so valuable because we can't do anything about those. So is that a way to think about which is more or less valuable in terms of inquiries, which things can affect our behavior more?
Absolutely, but I think the inferences you just drew were wrong. So if you're inquiring just before you die, like Socrates is in the Phaedo, and you're inquiring, then you're doing it with other people. Another admit. You're perforce doing it with other people because that's what inquiring is, according to Socrates. Those people are not about to die, let's suppose, like in the Phaedo. And so it's not useless to do the inquiry because they can continue that inquiry after you die, which is exactly what Socrates hopes will happen with, for instance, the inquiry that he's engaged in the Phaedo about the immortality of the soul. So it's not useless even then. It's going to change their behavior. Socrates also thought that I just gave you my view. It's also worth bringing in Socrates' view. Socrates thinks the soul is immortal and that the soul gets separated from the body, but it continues to exist and then will be reincarnated in another body. So that's another reason why you can just continue inquiring even at the very end of life, just from your own point of view. But I think he very much thought you should pick your topics on the basis of your own problem areas. So also in the Phaedo, he says, when I was a young man, I used to think a lot about natural science. I used to think about, how is it that you eat food and the food which is not made out of human flesh becomes human flesh, right? He's like, that stuff is not interesting questions, but at some point I focused in on what was really important, what was really going to matter for my life, which is something like, how do I be a courageous and just and generous person? How do I act properly in the situations in which I'm going to be confronted in, etc. And so that's a similar, in a way, it's a way of saying, when I chose love, death, and politics as being the application areas for the end of the book, I didn't choose those at random. I chose those as the places where inquiry and insight stands to do us the most good because we've made the least progress using other methods like technology or whatever. It doesn't seem to have touched our confusion in those three areas of life. So yes, I agree that we would want to differentially inquire in the places where we stand to be most benefited by the knowledge.
So I worry about a Ponzi scheme here, if you will. That is, if you say, we want inquiry and to help us into the other areas that are important in our life. And then we say the things that are in life that are important because they give us knowledge. Then how do we decide which knowledge matters? The knowledge that matters is the knowledge that gives us more knowledge, I guess.
I didn't say that those areas are important because they give us knowledge. I think those are the areas where we're the most confused. And where our confusion is also the most self-evident to us. And I try to show that. So okay. Maybe I give an example.
But the point is just, we need some other independent, separate concept of what's important in life. And then knowledge and inquiry is valuable to the extent it helps those other defined relative importances, which is fine. But I just wanted to point that out.
Maybe here's a way to think about it. I don't think that's right. So the way to think about it is, imagine if you were differentially a zombie, okay? So you were a zombie in certain contexts, in certain parts of your life. And you might want to de-zombify yourself, and you might want to think about, wait, where am I maybe most zombified, right? And I might want to address my de-zombification procedure to those parts of my life. Which ones should I pick? The ones where I'm the most zombified. And Socrates would say, you know where you're being like really, really a zombie? Love, death, and politics. So start there.
So you're using the level of knowledge we have or the level of confusion as the metric of importance of topic areas in order to gain inquiry. Even if that doesn't have much to do with your actual life, like astronomy or something. You could say, I'm really confused about astronomy, so I should put a lot of attention on that, even if I can't do much with astronomy.
I think what I mean by confusion is that you, in that part of life, are very far off from being able to own your own behavior, to be able to like call it your own. It's like you're going through motions. And that is not an issue that is very relevant for in relation to astronomy, except if you were an astronomer. If you were an astronomer and you were faking it all the time and making up your astronomical claims, or you didn't understand them, but you were just going through the motions and just kind of saying stuff other people said, that would be a problem and you should fix that if you're an astronomer. But the point is, we are all lovers, we are all political, and we are all going to die. So that's just a difference between that and the category of astronomer, which we just might not be astronomers. And so that confusion doesn't mess up our lives. It doesn't alienate us from ourselves.
So you and I are academics, and in the 2,400 years since Socrates, the world has developed many ways to organize itself into inquiry. Businesses inquire into business practices and customer preferences together. Academic disciplines apply to different fields together. Government agencies inquire into, regulatory practices together. And that's what these philosophers you were quoting and disagreeing with were roughly saying. Well, we have these ways that we inquire together, and let's just keep using those to inquire. And you're presenting yourself as disagreeing with them. And it seems like you're presenting yourself as suggesting a different way that we should be inquiring together relative to our usual ways that we coordinate to do so. So is it because the topic areas you focused on are different and therefore a different method of inquiry or style is called for these different topics? Or do you want to just say we're doing it wrong in all these other areas too?
I think that I have discussed this book with in some certain contexts, with people in law, business, tech, and what they all tell me is like, oh yeah, we're kind of doing something Socratic too in our space. There's something Socratic about our conversations and what we're doing when we are, trying to figure out some problem that we have. And so I'm not sure that what I'm saying is that there is that I want to substitute a Socratic method of inquiry for all other methods of inquiry. I'm inclined to think the Socratic method of inquiry is probably some kind of common denominator for all methods of inquiry anyway. I think what I'm more suggesting is that a lot of the parts of life that don't actually seem like they lend themselves to inquiry could.
So then it could be you're criticizing our emphasis on inquiry relative to other things we do with our time and priorities, or you could be criticizing the topics into which we acquire and thinking that those should be different than they are. It seems like you are, according to this quotes, you have some critique of the status quo. There's something about the status quo you don't think is quite right. These philosophers are embracing a status quo view of the place of philosophy and academia in the larger world, and we all specialize in our various topics, and then we bring that all together. And somehow it seems like you're saying something's wrong with that.
Right. I'm saying you already think that something is wrong with it. That is, I'm pointing out that the reader is committed to a more intellectual life than the life that they're currently living.
But they could live this more intellectual life by, again, having the specialized structure of academia where some of us focus on chemistry and economics and et cetera, versus all of us focusing more on these untimely questions. So it seems like you are.
It's more specific. So, right. So like just like I don't think anyone else could do your consciousness for you. That is, we couldn't solve the problem of me being a zombie by somebody else being conscious of my experiences. That wouldn't help at all from my point of view. It wouldn't help me feel like that was my life. And similarly, it wouldn't help with me feeling like I have ownership of my life and have an understanding and knowledge of what I'm doing if somebody else has it. I wouldn't have it is the problem, and I would still be, let's say, an ethical zombie of a certain kind. And so my thought is that there are that these Tolstoyan questions that we all have about our lives, that we are invested in the inquiry into those questions, that we all care about the answers, and that we engage in a lot of activities that are like twisted, confused versions of trying to inquire into them. So we could just straighten those out and actually just do the inquiry.
I'm still confused, though, about the degree of specialization you think appropriate. That is, again, with academics and philosophy even, say we think about love, the way academia is organized, some people might focus on the philosophy of love, or other social scientists could focus on the social science of love, and they would be the ones to figure out, what's most valuable in love and how we should think about love in terms of our basic untimely questions. And then if I was focused somewhere else, say in economics, then I wouldn't need myself to think about it directly. I would use this division of labor where we each thought about different topics and then brought our conclusions together into our shared knowledge that we then acted on. But it sounds like you're saying something different from that.
Well, I mean, there's a way in which maybe I can put the Socratic point in a way that's more friendly to the division of labor, but you're still not going to like it. So I think Socrates was very open to the thought that there were experts out there somewhere in Athens who just figured all of this out, and they had the ethical answers because they had specialized and found the answers. He sometimes thought he might be running into such a person in the form of Protagoras or Hippias or Gorgias, and he's like, "It's amazing! I found the expert, the one who has the answers. Please teach them to me." So I think if we had experts out there who had all this knowledge, then yeah, absolutely, just go find those people and have them teach it to you. You do need to have it. That is, you don't want to be walking around a zombie. You want to be walking around with the knowledge, but whether you have to be the one who finds it or not, I think Socrates is fine with the thought that you don't need to be the person who finds it if you can receive it. The thing is that the process by which you would receive it and the process by which you would inquire into it are the same process. That is, I mean, maybe it would be slightly easier to receive it, but you would have to test. You'd have to like check whether this is really the knowledge, right? And so you'd have to ask probing questions, which is what he does when he's confronted with someone like Hippias or Protagoras. He's like, well, wait a minute, you just said that, virtue is ruling over people, but you also said slaves can be virtuous. Is it that slaves are also supposed to rule over people or what? So the way that you try to extract the knowledge from the supposed expert is by the same Socratic method. And so the point is, it might not matter whether we could have a division of labor in that sense. It's just like, as a matter of fact, it doesn't actually seem like there's.
So let's stipulate, as I think you'll accept, is that on many of these questions we don't know, but we would like to work at it. We could still specialize in our working at it. And then whatever small things we do find, we can share with each other, even if there's only small contributions. But I think our current habits, and for a long time, most people's habits, are far more trusting than the picture you're presenting. That is, we might read a review article or a news magazine article about love or death or whatever it is, and see a quick summary of other people's arguments and views. And here maybe a summary of the consensus of the field is this. And we mostly don't do a lot of careful probing and questioning of most of those summaries that we get in our lives. We have too many topics and we're too busy, right? So is our usual practice of mostly trusting other sources on most of these things and then having a specialty focus where we put our extra effort into learning about that, is that roughly consistent with what you're recommending, or are you saying something different?
I mean, maybe it's worth pointing out that on the Socratic, sorry, hold on, I'm just being
Letting some people in.
I'm being texted. Um, uh, uh, um, on on the Socratic picture, there already is a division of labor inside the conversation. Namely, there is sorry, I'm gonna just turn off my
Go ahead.
hopefully that will solve it. Okay. There's a division of labor in the conversation, which is that there is an asserter and a refuter, right? So that's an acceptance of the concept of division of labor, that and that's to say, because this intellectual activity is a social activity, it has to be divided across people who are doing different jobs. Okay. So the but the question, your question is like, well, could we divide up the questions? Like maybe you and I will talk about courage, right? And some other people will talk about justice or something like that. I simply don't know how to make this stop. Is there some way to make my computer not receive text? Do you guys know?
Exit the app, perhaps.
Okay, I'll try that.
The text app.
Yeah. Quit. Okay. My phone's off now, but the computer still receives.
All right.
So like, I think that there's a way in which at any given time you can only pursue one question, right? One line of inquiry. That's a division. It's a division of labor. It was required. Like, you and I are going to talk about courage, and we're going to come to some answer. And then maybe another time, either somebody else or us will talk about justice. We can't talk about all the topics at once. And yes, I think that teaching each other what we learned in our other conversations makes sense. So but I guess I'm not really seeing that that's a that my proposal is distinctive in that respect.
I guess the key point is, are you criticizing the current distribution of activities in the world and in some way or not? That is, are you simply summarizing the current world and saying that's roughly right? Or are you saying, no, there is this way things should be different? It seems like from some of your words, you're saying things should be different. And I'm trying to probe for how exactly should it be different? Then you say,
yeah, I think that's not the most enlightening way to explore my book. That is, I think if you ask that question of my book, you won't learn what my book has to teach you. It's sort of like it's like a question that comes at it from the outside. So I would say, like, the right way to think of, and it's because my book is not an advice book. It's not really a book that's going to like tell you how to change your life or what you should do. It's not some version of self-help. I think only you can figure out how to change your life, and what kinds of changes in your life are going to make it more philosophical. So I don't know what to tell you about how to change your life. What I do know is to show you that you are confused and explain to you the nature of your confusion, and try to articulate what would it be to be less confused? What would that look like? And to show you like that there are sort of activities that are structured to work on this confusion. But my book is not a book that's like, well, we should have 10% more of this kind of conversation in this kind of space. That's just, I don't produce any arguments to that effect, so I couldn't make any claims to that effect.
well, then let's go on to one of your more specific topics. I will pick the last one, death, which I think is the largest section of the book.
It's not the largest section of the book.
But I mean, in terms of these, section 3 is where you try to, say what this implies more
Politics
concretely.
is a lot bigger.
Okay.
Politics is by far the biggest. I have 2 chapters.
Okay, but politics has like lots of different parts, and I thought death was more coherent, so I could just focus on one thing. So you give the example of this book, the story of Ivan Ilyich, and that his nearing death gave him distance from his life's projects that let him wonder whether he ever had any reason to pursue any of them, and that stressed him. And you say many ways of spending your life cannot stand up to death, collapsing in the face of it. Socrates demonstrates that philosophy is an exception. What helps Socrates face death was not his belief that the soul was immortal, but its inquiry into whether it was. The problem for death represents for us that our way of thinking about the time when nothing is left stands between us is when we can no longer put off these questions, and preparation for death is preparation for that time, and doing philosophy is how you do that preparation. So you are saying in here that, I understand you to be saying that the way you should approach death is inquisitively, and that inquiry is the source or next to or the essence of whatever is good about your activities and virtuous about your activities re death, because that's the claim more generally for the whole book. So then the question is, can we see in this section what you might consider as evidence for the claim that, in fact, inquiry is the way to find the good in death? And then the question is, which of the pieces of evidence or the things you mentioned do you see as evidence for that claim or argument for that claim? So I can list some of the things that you mentioned there. You certainly mentioned that people are avoiding thinking about death, and they're stressed sometimes at death to be thinking about it. In part, it's because they are stressed to be thinking about these untimely questions that they usually can avoid, but they are seeing at that moment. You show that philosophers who have had more practice in dealing with these sorts of questions may be less stressed at that time, may be more comfortable with
It's really
the
not
situation.
about stress.
Or
that's
something is better about something is better in their experience of it. Something happens better
life
to them.
doesn't seem to be sucked out, deprived of all meaning at the prospect of death. So what happens to Ivan Ilyich is not that he is stressed. That's just a huge understatement. What happens is that he loses all hope and faith in anything good. His life is completely deprived of all meaning. He hates his family, like actual bitter hatred.
Right.
He feels no total disconnect with the people that he works with. Right. So it's important. Let me finish what I'm saying. Right. It's important that this is not the same thing as stress. What it is life becoming meaningless, pointless, vacuous. Oh, it's a little bit like the zombie thing, but on the other side. It's like flipped, right? You're not unconscious, but there's nothing to be connecting to. There's nothing to be aware of. So it's horrific.
So
not stress.
Right. So having a situation where you have an untimely question that you're forced to look at that you don't feel you know the answer to is unpleasant and
not bad because it's unpleasant. That's not the right way to characterize it. It's not bad because it's stressful.
We want to have an answer to that. He doesn't have an answer to that, so he lacks something he wants. Then you say the philosopher has an answer to what the point is inquiry. So the philosopher doesn't have this lack because they have an answer, and therefore it's good about philosopher in death is they have an answer to this question that the Ilia does not have.
No, that's not the difference. So the philosopher, in fact, is only too aware that his answers are not that good. Even Ilyich had answers, right?
Right.
That was in a way the problem. He had reflexive, unthought through answers that the point of life.
Unsatisfactory answers are he found to be unsatisfactory.
Right. So he had a set of answers that, like, the point of life is to be kind of socially climbing and, a good bourgeois Russian, and to be, have this wife and this kid, and he, when those answers are in some way destabilized, he has nowhere to go. He can't just inquire into the question. He can't just be like, okay, well then how should I live? And I think that, what the prospect of death represents is kind of having these questions be unavoidable. And with the prospect of death doesn't mean you're necessarily about to die. Even Ilyich is about to die. But also the prospect of death came when he was 50. So what the prospect of death is that these questions that were in the corner of your eye suddenly come right in front of you and you can't avoid them anymore. And if you're a philosopher, well, you've been practicing for this moment. In fact, you've been living it. You are constantly facing death, right? So that's why Socrates says that philosophy is the preparation for death, because It is the kind of confrontation with questions that are too hard for you to answer, and yet you inquire into them anyway. And you know you're having a conversation. You know that even at the end of this conversation, you're not going to have the answer, but you still have the courage to try and inquire into it in the face of that fact. And that makes it possible for you, even though you know that your process of inquiry is going to be cut off by death, to continue to inquire because you've been practicing these cutoff.
Right, but why is that good? It's the key question. That is, an analogy might be, hey, at the end of life, you might be in a lot of pain. So to prepare for a lot of pain in the end of life, let's make sure you have more pain earlier in life, and then you'll be used to the pain, and the pain won't bother you as much at the end of life, right? You might say, inquiry, untimely questions are painful. The philosopher is used to them by going through the pain other times, so they're more used to the pain. But why was that good pain?
Right, so it's not about avoiding pain. That's the wrong characterization. The point is that there is a, in many parts of this book, what I try to do is show you that you spend a lot of your life looking at something like a reflection in water. Let's say it's a reflection of a house in water. And it's kind of wavy and wobbly. And you're looking at it and you're like, that's such a weird house. Why are the windows, wobbling and moving? And then I want to be like, well, look over here. Here's the house. And you're asking me, how many houses should we build? Should we have as many houses as possible? Why are houses good? And what I want to say is, I'm kind of straightening something out on the, what I'm saying is, well, the fact that you panic, or let's say that even Ilyich panics in this way in response to death, of course, for Tolstoy, that is written out of his own experience, right? And out of his own panic. And let's say that all of us are in some way like this. So we're in some way like Tolstoy. We're in some way like even Ilyich. Then what we already are is people who feel very compelled by these questions, but also terrified at the thought that there's no possibility of making any progress on them. And what I'm saying is, let me show you how you actually can make progress on them. Now you're like, well, why should I? And I want to say, because you think you should. That is what I'm showing you. The you think you should is the wavy house. It's that I can show you evidence that you're already behaving like a person who is committed to these inquiries.
I could say I would find it uncomfortable and distressing even to see that I didn't have answers to untimely questions.
Mm-hmm.
And that would just bother me.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were a practiced philosopher, I would know that I still didn't have answers and that my short inquiry before I die was not going to get me much closer to them. So I don't see why I should be very comforted with the fact that I could spend the last few hours inquiring a little bit farther. But since the last 70 years hadn't gotten me, it only got me this far, I don't see why another couple of hours would get me as far. Why should I be comforted or at all less stressed or less distressed by the fact that I could spend another hour on it before I died?
That's definitely not my argument. My argument isn't you should spend your whole life philosophizing so that in the hour before you die, you can then also do philosophizing, and then that will make the prospect of death not scary to you. That's not my argument. For one thing, that's not how we die now. Okay, these days, the way we die, we are very profoundly incapacitated when we die. Okay, almost all of us. So we don't die the way Socrates died. So this is not going to happen. Okay, so I'm not threatening you. I'm not trying to threaten you with an even Ilyich moment in the hours before you die. That's not the structure of the argument of this chapter. The structure of the argument of this chapter is that this thing that comes out for even Ilyich, where it happens to come out in the moments before he dies, and that it comes out for Tolstoy well before he dies, when he's 50, that this fear of death is not just something that happens at the end of your life. This fear of death is haunting you your whole life. And the fear of death, in a way, is the fear of philosophy. It's the thought, is there any point to anything that I'm doing? And what I'm saying is you could address that by trying to figure it out.
But if I didn't think I could actually make very much progress, I don't see why that would be very comforting to me. That is, well, look,
it's not supposed to be very comforting.
Most people don't even like to think about death, and they successfully avoid thinking about death till they have to, exactly because they don't judge it to be worth their trouble to think about death. So why should I think about untimely questions if I'm not actually going to make much progress on them?
So You could also avoid a lot of discomforts by doing the zombie route. There are a lot of ways to avoid discomforts, but we don't think that they're all good ways to avoid discomfort. Discomfort, as I said, the point here is not that you get less stress or more pleasure. That's not the argument. Sometimes you should have discomfort and stress, and those can be good things.
Right.
So the point, and the point is that
I think you're just telling me that the idea that inquiry is what I want is self-evident. That is, if I would
No.
look at it carefully, it's just the thing I want, and
no,
therefore,
a lot of my book is trying to argue for that.
but we're going through one section here of death, and we're saying what in the death section tells me that I want to inquire in death, or at death, or about death.
Well, if you accept my diagnosis of what it is that makes death terrifying, which you might not, okay, but let's say you accept it, that's the diagnosis we've already described, namely that death makes unavoidable a certain question that we can sort of succeed in avoiding a lot of the rest of the time, then this question is one that, like, if we weren't being avoidant, is important to us and bothers us. And so I'm saying there's something that's important to you. I'm not saying it should be, I'm saying it is. It already is important to you. If you were honest with yourself, you would see that it's important to you. And you think you can't be honest with yourself because you think the costs of that honesty are too high because you're not going to get anywhere anyway. And what I'm saying is you can be honest with yourself. Now, you can ask me like, well, what's so good about being honest with yourself? It's a little, you could also ask me, what's so good about consciousness? Why shouldn't I just be a zombie? And at a certain point, I do have to I have to sort of assume you have some intuitions about like what it would be to lead a good life, where that's not identical to having the most pleasure for most people.
I could accept the idea that I should face the truth and admit my lack of good answers to untimely questions. But that seems to me separate from taking effort to inquire into those questions, relative to all the other things I could inquire to or do with my life. And so that's what I take the point of this section and the book is to say, you really do or should care more about this inquiry part. And I might say, well, I'm not sure I should. Just because I have a question I don't have the answer to doesn't inspire me to seek the answer if I think it's just going to be really hard and I'm not going to get very far.
So if we think about the relative to all the other things that you could do with your life, there's a question, why should you do any of those things that you want to do with your life? That's the question I'm suggesting that you spend some time looking into, because maybe you came up with terrible answers and all the things you think you should do with your life are bad things and worthless things and you're wasting your whole life. And let's say that's a possibility. Let's say that's a real possibility. Now you might say, well, that doesn't matter to me. I don't care. At a certain point, it's like, what is this conversation even? What is this conversation if you really don't care whether your life is a worthless life or whether you're spending it doing anything valuable? But if you do care about whether your life is a good life, whether you're spending it doing something valuable, then you're going to want to like do some examination of your reasons for thinking that the things that you do are good or valuable. That's just what I'm suggesting.
So that looks to me more like a decision theory information value calculation. I'm not sure you would resist that, but if I would say, if I think about what my various priorities could be, there's a space of possible priorities it could have, and then there's this space of priorities I am acting on that I'm inheriting from the fact that the answer came before the question. Then there's this question, well, how far wrong could I be? So if I think I'm probably pretty close to exactly the right answer, then I'll think it's not actually worth that much trouble to figure out just how to adjust it just a little bit, Maybe, health should be 37% instead of 36%, and love should be 28 instead of 27%. And, I'm pretty close. That's the point of working through all this little thing. If I think I'm close, if I think my priorities are actually roughly right what they should be, then I won't actually think it's a high priority to go investigate these questions if that looks really hard and time consuming, and I'd rather do the health and love thing. But if I thought I could be way off, I could just, one of these categories that I'm putting 5% off, it should be 95%, and I could just be way, way off. Now, a standard value of information calculation in decision theory would say, well, now you should be putting a lot of effort into this meta question of whether you have the right priorities. So it seems to me like implicitly you're saying, hey, you could be way off. And that's part of the argument of your book, is to suggest, but you don't say directly, yeah, you could just be really wrong.
So, what I do say directly is that Socrates walks up to people and, in effect, says that. That is, what he does is he takes the part of their life that is most important to them. So it's where they're putting 95%. And it might be for Alcibiades about ruling the world. For some generals, it's about what is courage. For a kid, he asks, do your parents really love you, Lysis? To Charmides, who's kind of this teenage heartthrob. Okay, all the men are after him. He asks, do you know the meaning of moderation, i.e. sexual moderation? So for each person, he finds the place where they're putting 95%. Okay, let's put it that way. And what he does is he gets them to just talk about that thing, and they contradict themselves. That is, they describe it one way, they describe it another way, which suggests they don't know what they're after. That is, they can't come up with a coherent description of their target or of what they want. And that's the problem. There isn't just they're putting their priorities wrong. The problem is like they don't have any grasp of what their priorities are. Their priority is something that it's a little bit like, wait, hold on. Let me just finish my sentence. It's a little bit like what someone might interpret. I'm not even saying this is correct, but it's a natural interpretation of like Jeff Bezos saying, what I really care about is liberty, and that's why the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal will from now on only be able to have two opinions, pro free market or pro liberties, because I believe in freedom and freedom of speech, right?
Now,
so you might say that's just kind of an incoherent thing to say. And that's what Socrates was doing to people, is he was saying, the thing you're saying, the words that are coming out of your mouth are contradicting each other. And so when you say, this is my project, freedom of speech, and then you say the next thing, that doesn't fit together. And so you can't possibly be pursuing your goals because your conception of your goal is a contradiction.
Most animals very simply can't articulate their priorities or their, which things matter more to them, but they act according to priorities. And we might think that natural selection has endowed them with habits that are functional for them, that do make sense for them, even if they don't know what these are and can't articulate them. And then we might say, well, humans have this new ability to reason and articulate, but we're not very good at it. We are still animals who have habits that we don't fully understand. And if we trusted natural selection, either of DNA or culture, to roughly be giving us correct instructions about how to live our lives, we might plausibly expect not to be able to articulate that very well, not to explain it, not to even be very conscious of it. But that doesn't mean we're wrong. It just means we can't say it very well. So I guess that for many people, I think they are in fact trusting their culture, their biology, their origin to give them a momentum of habit that works for them. And you are calling that into question. You are saying you should doubt more this trust you have in your origins. And I just wanted to point that out, I guess, to see if you would disagree or not with it. But basically, the more you trust your culture, your family, your school, your biology, your innate habits, then even if you don't know how to describe them and give them categories and relative descriptions, you could still roughly be right about what you're doing, because that's what you would expect selection to have produced. Animals aren't random. They have pretty consistent behaviors, even though they can't articulate and describe them. But if we look at them, they typically make sense in terms of what those animals need to do to survive and reproduce.
So I think that the question, do you trust biology and natural selection, is a different question from the question, do you trust culture? Those are two very different.
Well, culture is natural selection, just of a different form.
It's not as natural, it's cultural, right? That's why it's called culture, is that it's not natural. It's still selection. I don't think anyone trusts their biology. Like, I would be shocked if anyone in this group said, oh, I just think biology will teach me like what's moral, what's a good life, how to be a good person. I just let biology take over and I'll like do all the right things. You don't think that, otherwise you wouldn't have stuck in all the culture stuff. You started the sentence with biology, and then you added
I think culture is biology, but it's a special kind of biology.
I want to separate, right?
Okay, but fine. Happy to accept the distinction.
I agree that at the bottom of the biology is physics. So I mean, yes, okay, it's all little tiny things moving around, but we carve off
Right.
we can carve off a story of biological evolution, and nobody thinks that that story tells you how you should live your life. So if you just ask, like, what are my what are my biological inclinations telling me to do? Nobody thinks that's sufficient. That's what, again, you don't think it is, which is why you added the culture bit. As far as culture is concerned, I mean, another thing is, like, do we think that non-human animals live happy lives? That's another way to think about the biology thing. That is, like, would you trade? Say you could be a cat, spend the rest of your life as a cat, spend the rest of your life as an ant, a bacterium, an elephant. I mean, I think most people would not want to live a life in which they are fully driven by biology in that way. And it would be a little bit like the zombie case. And that would be the life in which you cannot articulate to yourself, as far as we know, okay? We would be wrong about elephants or something, but as far as we know, you cannot articulate to yourself the point of anything that you're ever doing if you are a non-human animal. That's a big part of what makes that unattractive. We like them. We like having, well, some people, I don't like them that much, but many people like non-human animals, like having them around, like seeing them. But do you want to be one? I mean, I don't know. Maybe somebody does, but I find that kind of that would be surprising to me if you would want to be one. And then, as far as culture is concerned, do we trust our culture? I mean, I think the answer is mostly no. People don't actually trust their cultures. You don't trust your culture, Robin, because you think it's been drifting for quite some time, and has not been subjected to the right sorts of evolutionary pressures. But I think it's funny, it's interesting that even in the ancient world, there was already enough distrust of culture for this inquiry to get going. And I think it's because the very idea of trusting culture is sort of trusting that an answer could be given, that it could be articulated, even if I can't do it right now. Like, maybe if I tried really hard, or if I asked the right people. And if all that ever comes out of anyone's mouth when they try to explain it is gibberish, then that's actually the moment when you start to doubt culture, is as a result of that kind of conversation. I think that's a big part of why Socrates was killed, actually, is this. It's that everybody did trust their cultures. And then Socrates is like, yeah, great, this culture is probably really good. So just explain to me, like, why is it doing this? Why is it doing this? And then total collapse. And it's like, oh, well, maybe now we don't trust our culture anymore.
But just to be clear, in order to see the lack of our ability to articulate our priorities as a great criticism of our culture, we do have to expect our culture to have given us relatively understandable and articulable priorities and to have explained them to us. That is,
no, we don't need the second part. All we need, like let's say that all of our, like, physics stuff, all of our, like, physics research, like, contradicted itself, right? And you might say, well, look, what if the world is just really contradictory? And, whoever promised you that the world was going to make sense, or something like that. And you want to say, well,
I mean, we might say, look, most people don't actually think they have huge theories of their behavior and priorities, but there's a few pompous blowhards who go around pretending they do, and that was Socrates' victims. He was, predator to that prey, these people who pretended to know a lot more than they do, but most people don't actually give you theories of justice or other sorts of things, so they aren't actually as incoherent as you're describing. It's only the intellectuals who have pretenses to actually understand themselves well, who are easy to or feasible to show that they are confused.
He didn't only talk to such people. So he actually talked to just a very great variety of people. So some of them were like children almost, or teenagers who were very shy and were like, I don't really know anything, Socrates. And Socrates is like, try, just guess, whatever, say something. I think he did somewhat favor people who conceived themselves prominent intellectuals, because they felt that they owed him answers, right? So Another kind of person might just be like really persist in this. I don't know, Socrates, you tell me. Many people do try that with him. I think that Socrates, one thing that's amazing is he's pretty good at pulling, like, everyone does really think they know. Everyone's super arrogant. That's the truth about everybody. But we're pretty guarded about that. We know we're not supposed to let that show. Partly you don't want to let it show because you become prey, right? Because then someone can be like, well, just give me that great explanation that you have. And so the result is that you need a skill. Socrates has a skill of bringing out the side of the person that thinks that they know, even if they want to keep, that person wants to keep that side of themselves private to protect it from inquiry. Socrates is good at bringing it out, but it's easiest to bring out with pompous blowhards. That's absolutely true, which is why he had a special love for pompous blowhards. I would say they were some of his favorite people.
I think we have enough time to maybe discuss love here before we break to do Q&A.
Okay, yeah, I think we should do Q&A in like 4 minutes.
4 minutes, okay. Well, then
Well,
we
because
can't.
that's 7. We start at 6:30, so that's
Right,
7.
but right, but we want to have. You want to do half the whole time Q&A? Then that
I
would
think
be
so.
okay.
Yeah. Look,
Okay.
if they're having questions, you can ask me more questions. But yeah.
Well, I guess maybe then in the last 4 minutes, I'd want to say that the thing that I see as most potent emotionally in your book and presentation is the way that you are appealing to people's aspirations and view of what is high, and you're presenting Socratic inquiry as high in a way that sells. That is, many people could sell. I mean, most ads are trying to sell lots of things as high and make you buy them, but of course they fail. But you are succeeding to a substantial degree in selling this idea as you're wanting to be the sort of person who would inquire as a grand and noble and high sort of person to be. And that's plausibly in some sense because that's a resource in our culture, at least. That is, we have already innate respect for that. So respect for intellectuals is part of that, but here this is also more of a respect for the person who confronts their own demons and their own most difficult questions. And so I think you are drawing on a powerful resource and pushing, and selling people on the idea that there is something they already do and want to aspire to, and giving it a name and a description and saying, you could join us high people if you would take on our high goal, our high, of inquiring. And then you are not just making the abstract intellectual, like discover stuff thing, but you are inquiring into something that is itself high. That is, you are combining the high noble aspiration and status and respect we have for inquiry with the respect we have for knowing what you want, being able to not sound stupid when you say what you want and your priorities, and in fact to have a coherent sense of what in fact matters. So I guess that's not a very well articulated question, but I guess I'm asking you to react to, do you see yourself as achieving that? And is that okay?
I would not have described myself in any of those ways. I think like they're very unflattering set of terms, in that people would generally not say, oh well, I'm trying to like say I'm high status. You can be high status too if you're like me. That's the project of
I
your
only use the word status once.
It
All the
doesn't
other words
matter
I
if you
use
use
were
the word
pretty
or not. I can
positive
hear
words.
that that's the word that's behind it. But I think it's not totally wrong. It's just here's how I would put it. If you this is not a question about love, by the way. But
Right.
in the part of the book between part 2 and part 3, so before I start talking about love, death, and politics, I describe a thing that I call the Socratizing move. And the best way to understand the Socratizing move is to contrast it with a reductive move that is popular in many different parts of intellectual inquiry. So the reductive move says that something that you respected, something that you kind of valued and kind of thought that was important, is really nothing but something that you don't respect very much. So it might be something like, well, like there are many thinkers who there's just one thing they think everything is about, right? So for Freud, everything that you didn't think was about sex is actually about sex. For Foucault, it's all about power. For Girard, it's all about violence. You might think, oh, well, perception of color is like nothing but, wavelengths of light hitting different parts of your eye. You might say education is nothing but signaling. Um, um, love is nothing but the pursuit of self-interest or something like that, right? So the formulation of this move, of this reductive move, is something like A is nothing but B, or A is really B. So it's a common and popular like reductive move, and might be correct about something. I'm not denying that it could possibly be correct, but I'm only just using it to contrast. So Socrates's signature move, as I call it, so this is the Socratizing move, is to make a move very much like that. A is really B, except A is something that you've already, same thing, something you have some respect for, whatever. And B is something you have even more respect for. So everything is way better than you thought it was, basically. It's an anti-reductive move. It's an upward reduction or whatever, upcycling. If you have like erotic problems, like toxic romance, that's really an intellectual confusion. If you have like, political squabbles, that's really just an attempt to argue. Terror at the prospect of death, that's really just the failure to have philosophized. I think that it's not just that what I'm trying to do is say like, here's a noble thing, you can have it. I think Socrates has like kind of institutes this as a move, right? That is that he can take a lot of different areas of your life. He's not just telling you, he's showing you. You got to sell it, right? You can't just say A is nothing but B and expect people to accept it. Even the reductive version requires like argument and work, right? To show that the thing really is the other thing. And so I'm saying Socrates does that work to show that the thing really is the higher thing. It's not just associating it or claiming it or saying you can have this thing. It's selling it. That your erotic problems really are intellectual problems.
Do you worry about wishful thinking there? I mean,
absolutely, you should be worried about wishful thinking.
There's
Just
basically how plausible is it that almost
Yeah.
everything really behind the scenes is our highest ideal thing, as opposed to there's some other not so high ideal things in the world?
Sure. I think it's fine to have that worry in the abstract, but when someone gives you an argument, you're supposed to address it in the concrete, right? So someone could, when we're talking about the A is nothing but B in the reductive version of the move, you might say, oh, well, isn't that convenient? Like you just enjoy being cynical and like, everything is always something terrible and etc. Like we could make those same dismissive moves. But the question is, well, does it really work in a given case?
Right. If we had more time, we would go into the love example, but if you want to stop now, let's stop and open it up for questions, which I presume will mostly be for you.
I think I do want to give the love example. So we'll give one example of this. Okay. So here's like a little piece of what I say in the love chapter. Here's a thing that happens in start here. Imagine you have a friend, and the friend they're outside of a restaurant and they're banging on the doors of the restaurant, and you tell them that restaurant's closed, and they just keep banging, and you're like, look, there are these other restaurants right nearby that are open. And they just keep banging. They're like, I have to go to this restaurant. And you say, like, why? Is it that the food is so amazing? And they say, no, it's horrible. I hate the food here. Like at that point, you think, okay, there's something wrong with this person. You would say, maybe you need help, you need therapy, like something is off with you. You're like not right in the head that you're this behavior that you're doing. But now let's switch over. Okay, it's your friend. And she dated this guy for a while. It was horrible. It was a toxic relationship. It was like terrible in every way. It finally broke up. And now she's about to text him again. You're like, don't text him. Remember, you hate him, right? There's all these other guys out there. it's the same scenario. It's the food scenario. But when somebody is doing this in relation to romance, we're like, oh yeah, that's how love works. So we've normalized something. We've normalized insanity, basically, in a romantic context. People behave in ways that are insane. And the thought is, Socrates' thought is like, maybe we have to shift our conception of what is it that you're even wanting in a romantic context that could explain this kind of insane behavior. And he then offers an explanation, which is that in the context of love, you fixate on a person, but what you really actually love is a certain ideal. And you can straighten out your pursuit of love by coming to understand that and by coming to realize that what another person is for you is a way of inquisitively pursuing that ideal. I'm not going to go in more into that last bit, but it's really the first bit that's important to say. That's the part that's the muddy image in the water, right? There's something confused about what we're doing, and then that should give you reason to think, well, what would it look like if it were straightened out? What would it look like if we could see the house?
So I think all through the book, you are taking familiar things and you're making the following two observations. One, you're saying, we seem to be a bit confused. And the other is, and we have trade-offs and conflicts. And then you say, well, if we replace our usual concept of that thing with inquiry as the goal, well, then the trade-offs go away. And if you just believe that, there's no confusion and two problems solved. But in the case of love, it seems to me that you have to go too far to get that gain. That is, the idea of love as inquiry just seems too far from what we actually experience and want. But that's what more we would say if we went into that. But for the now, I guess we will leave it there.
Okay. Okay, questions?
There's hands, and I guess you can pick
Oh, I see now.
at the top.
Jennifer.
Hey there.
Hey.
I'm not sure I understood all of that. I'm going to try to make this a quick and articulate question. At some point, you were saying, I think I understood, that we go through life avoiding important questions because we, on some level, think they're unanswerable. And so what's the point? And so we're just going to put them to the background because they're unanswerable. And then later on, I thought you said that most people actually do think they already have these answers and that it's kind of arrogant. And we already think we have it explained. And Socrates was pushing back against that. Your explanation is actually not right, or you don't have it as figured out as you think you do. And that sounded contradictory, and I wasn't sure if I understood it properly.
So, I think that maybe the part that I went over too fast is we do think that we have answers. That is, we have to think we have answers because we're using the answers. It's like, how should I live my life? Well, you're living your life in some way, which is the answer. We live our lives on the basis of answers to questions. And that's sort of why the thing I was saying to Robin about how you just have to find the part of the person that's going to insist, because everybody thinks they have the answers. But what we don't have, is a kind of coherent and articulate grasp of those answers, or an explanation of why they're good answers. It's sort of like, imagine if you if there were some question like why don't houses collapse? And you had an answer that you were given as a child, and the answer was something like they're made of atoms. Let's say that was the answer, right? And you just give that answer, and then and you're like, that's good, that works. They don't collapse because they're made of atoms. And then someone's like, well, wait a minute, why? How does that, something that does collapse is also made of atoms, and doesn't it matter how the atoms are arranged? And it's like, oh, I never thought about that. I kind of just had this thing that I said. except it's even slightly worse than that, because often there isn't even anything you have to say. You're just kind of doing stuff and you feel, okay, this makes sense. This is how I'm supposed to be living. So I think that if I'm getting you right, like the thing you're sort of noticing as the tension is that, like, on the one hand, nobody has answers, but on the other hand, everybody has answers. And the point is, everybody takes themselves to have answers, but those answers aren't very good and they don't stand up to inquiry. And that's because the answers didn't come from asking the question. So we didn't talk about this, but a big part of the book is about, where did we get the answers if we never asked the questions and we just magically, the answers just showed up. And the two sources, what I claim the two sources of the answers are your body, okay, just like, you know, you're hungry, you're tired, whatever, and your body just says eat, or it says sleep, and it's like shouts at us. And you never asked it, you never said, hey body, what should I do? It just gives you those answers. And so a lot of what we do is just dictated by that, but it's not, I wouldn't say a super high percent, like it's going to be maybe 20%. But then the rest is other people. That is, other people tell us what to do. We conform to the people around us. And that's also, it's a kind of answer that we didn't get those answers by inquiring. We just kind of soaked it in. How you're supposed to dress, how you're supposed to talk, what holidays are you supposed to celebrate? Do you believe in God or not? Well, did the people who raised you believe in God or not? That's going to be a pretty good predictor. Do you know, what's the right way to treat people? Like, it's mostly you soaked it in from the people around you. And so those answers are not answers that were arrived at inquisitively. They were arrived at, I call them savage commands. You were savagely commanded by your body or by other people, and that's most of the explanation of why you do what you do. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Chinedum.
Yeah, thanks for the conversation. So I have maybe two questions I'm going to ask. And so the first one is kind of at the end of the interaction with Robin. You said something about what it is we're wanting in the pursuit of love is like we fixate on a person, but what we're after is really, you know, some idea maybe. And then earlier in the talk, you said something about how Socrates, the Socratic method, does this move of upcycling, you know, of taking this thing which we want to downgrade and make and upgrading it in some way. But is it an upgrade to say when someone is after a person, they're really after an idea? Is an idea an upgrade of a person?
That's a great question. So I think yeah. So one way to see that is that when we fall in love with someone, we idealize them. That is, we sort of, at least for a little while, we're inclined to see them as being in some way perfect. Socrates would say that's just you smooshing the ideal onto the person. And which is not to say that there's inherently always going to be distance between the ideal and the person. A person could come to match an ideal. That's exactly what you want to do in your striving. What you want to do in loving someone is you want to become perfect. You want to match that ideal yourself, right? That's what it is to want the ideal, is to want to instantiate it. And they could do that too. And so you could both end up really awesome. And then maybe you would, in fact, be in some sense interchangeable with the ideal. But the point is that that what the person, like when you fall in love with them, they're kind of a placeholder for or a reminder of the ideal. They suddenly bring perfection into your life, bring the idea of perfection into your life. And Socrates is like, that's right, that's what you should be thinking, but you then shouldn't be like devastated if they're imperfect, because they are just a person, they are just a human being. And what they can be for you is someone together with whom you can and they can strive to become more perfect. But that process is going to be inhibited by your persisting in confusing them for the ideal that you both really want.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna think about that, but
Okay.
I don't know if like others have questions, but
Yeah.
I have one last one I can leave for later.
Okay, save it and we'll come back to you. I think we're gonna have time for another question. Okay, Robbie?
Hi, thanks for the presentation.
Yeah.
My question was about the priority of knowledge as the goal of life and how you're determining that. Um, because it seems like plausibly the goal could be action because knowledge finds its fruit in action. Like the goal of unclogging a toilet is to have a unclogged toilet rather than to know why it's good to have an unclogged toilet or just to know how to unclog the toilet. So I do appreciate the point that the knowledge of the action is what kind of allows the action to be intentionally good, as opposed to um, merely kind of zombie good. But then you could say why not have the goal be intentionally good action, for example, as opposed to knowledge taking priority.
Good. So, Socrates thinks that everyone desires the good, and that if you know what's good, you're going to do it. And so, it's definitely consistent with at least some of the text to think what knowledge is the fundamental tool that allows you to get whatever's good. That is, everyone already desires the good, but the problem is that we don't necessarily know what it is, right? And so if we had the knowledge, then we could pursue it in a perfectly straightforward and unerroneous way. But so the natural reading of that would be not even that action is good, but that, I mean, you're not unclogging the toilet to be unclogging the toilet, right? You're unclogging it to bring about a result, which is the result of, having an unclogged toilet, but that's probably also not going to be the end all and be all of your existence, right? We're probably going to need to go a few steps further as to like, well, why do you want to have an unclogged toilet? And so there's a question, okay, what is the like end state that we're aiming for? Is it a cognitive state? Is it a state of affairs in the world, like scenario that comes about? Or is it an action? And actually different ethical theories give different answers to that question. So like, what is the target? What does the telos look like? So utilitarianism tends to say, oh, you're trying to bring about some state of affairs in the world, like people being as pleased as possible or something like that. As many people being as pleased as possible. That's the like result that you're trying to bring about. You're trying to make that happen. However it can happen, you're trying to make that happen. A Kantian might say, no, what really matters is that you act well. And so the action itself, actually, not even the action, it's going to be the intention for the Kantian, right? It's going to be the fact that the intention is consistent with the moral law. So the quality of your will. Okay. Your body could be oddly disconnected from your will, and so you end up doing different things and not actually behaving well, even though you have a good understanding, and that would be fine from a Kantian point of view. And then the Aristotelian thinks, no, it really is the action, not the intention, the action, but only the action insofar as it is both informed by choice, so you can't have the zombie case, and also apprehended by other people. That is, the fullest thing is the beautiful action, and it's only going to be beautiful if someone can see it. So it may be that you should be the one who sees it. Actually, I think first and foremost, it is you who see it, but you seeing it is not the same thing as just you doing it. He says, Aristotle says that's why we need friends, because it's harder to perceive our own actions than our friends. So this question of perceiving the action it's not trivial. It's not obvious that you just perceive your own actions. Okay. So these are three different answers to the question, sort of what's the end state? Is it the intention, the action, or the state of affairs? And then the question is, okay, what is it for Socrates? And I think that Socrates says things where it's sort of consistent actually with any of the three of these, though the state of affairs one would only be under a very weird reading, like a state of affairs which includes the knowledge as part of the state of affairs. And so maybe the thing to say is that, well, he's not it. Socratic ethics is an ethics that is devoted to knowledge. It's an ethics where the end point of that ethical striving is knowledge. That's not the same thing as saying the end point of human life is knowledge. Socratic ethics may not be the final ethics, even in its own understanding, right? The point is, in order to do anything well, you need knowledge. And once we have knowledge, we'll figure out what kind of endpoint we're supposed to be aiming at. And so I'm inclined to think that we can say knowledge is the endpoint of Socratic ethics, but maybe not commit ourselves to the claim that even for Socratic, knowledge is the endpoint of human life. Once you have knowledge, then you'll be faced with the next question. And these options that you put on the table, that these other theories put on the table, will all be live options.
Yeah, that distinction between the aim of the ethics and trusting that the knowledge is capable of finding the good, and separating that from the actual goal of human life. I think that distinction answers the question that I originally posed. So, yeah, thanks.
Marcus.
Hello.
Hello.
Curious if you have like thoughts or advice on like setting the tone for a Socratic conversation. All right, so like an intellect group or salon is sort of implied, or like a university classroom, it's implied that you might have conversations like these. I think even like Socrates himself implied, these kind of conversations, right? It's like, oh boy, here comes Socrates. He's going to ask me what I'm avoiding and thinking about death. But if I like want to bring this up with my friends, can I just say like, why are you doing anything at all? Or like, do I start there? Or I feel like people like get defensive.
Yeah.
So like, how do you set the tone on this? Like, all right, we're gonna learn something together here. We're gonna have this kind of discussion.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And it's one that it's the question that I walk away from this book thinking about. And so I don't think I have an amazing answer, but I'm working on it. But a story that I tell in the book is that like when I was in college, I was like, Socrates is amazing. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go up to strangers and ask them philosophy questions. And like I did this, I went to the Art Institute. I was a student at the University of Chicago, and the Art Institute was kind of like in Chicago. It's kind of the agora. It's like the place outside on the steps. It's like where people hang out. So like the town square. And so I went to the steps in front of the Art Institute, and I went up to people and I was like, do you want to have a philosophical conversation? And then most of them said yes, which was surprising to me. And then I would be like, okay, what makes something art? What is the meaning of life? That kind of like these kind of questions. And it went terrible. They did not enjoy this. They seemed sort of scared of me. These conversations didn't go anywhere. They were kind of defensive. They were like, what is she up to? They were just confused by what I was doing. And so I think that, so that's strangers, and friends is difficult in a different way. With your friends, you have an established pattern of interaction that you would be disrupting, where the disrupting of that pattern is itself a signal of a certain kind that is liable to confuse your friends. Why are we talking differently all of a sudden? And so I think you're absolutely right. This is a real problem. It's like, it's not clear you can do this with strangers, and it's not clear you can do it with the people that you were close to. That's not to say you can't in either case. I think you kind of can, but it's not clear that you can. It's not obvious. There's not an obvious way of how to do it. I mean, here's sort of my hope. And as I say, this is what I'm working on right now, but I'm hoping I didn't have to work on it all by myself. There's a thing where like when I first got pregnant, all of a sudden I saw like pregnant people everywhere. And I don't think it's because all of a sudden there was a pregnancy epidemic in Berkeley, California, where I was. It was that I could suddenly see something that I just hadn't been paying attention to. And so my hope about this book is that it will just put people on the lookout for certain sets of opportunities that are there, that are already there. So like in your conversations with your friends, there actually are these little opportunities. There are these little ins. There are these little places where you could be like, oh, why is that? Like moments where you could ask a question. It will be a slight disruption, but the point is that you can find the smallest disruption, right? But that's a matter of sort of skill and practice. I do actually also just think that certain kinds of institutional formats are good and work. So, like discussion groups, my own view is they do tend to work a bit better in person, but it sort of depends. My husband has some online discussion groups that he does where he's like been devoted to them for a long time and they work really well. So they work worse for me, maybe is the truth of it. But I think I often think that actually having a text that you're discussing really helps because you can sort of get some distance. You can alienate the untimely questions onto the text a little bit. And so people don't feel as likely to like feel attacked. So many philosophical conversations work well because there's some text, especially the Socratic dialogues I find are work really well to, we can discuss what is courage by talking about the Lakeys, right? And we don't immediately have to question which of us is a coward, which is what's happening in the Lakeys, but it's not happening to us if we're having the conversation about the Lakeys. So I think in terms of discussion groups, having something that focuses the conversation and also like that kind of sets the tone for it's being an intellectual conversation, right? It's like we're not just getting together to chat because we have this thing we have to talk about. Anyway, yeah, those are my thoughts, but I'm also like very receptive to other people's thoughts about this question because it is something I'm thinking about a lot now.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll try some things out and report back.
Cool. I would love that. Adam, hi.
Hi. So I was wondering why, or if it's really important to approach sort of Tolstoyan questions through dialogue. So in the initial exchange between you and Robin, Robin was sort of proposing a division of intellectual labor where you have different people with different expertises approaching different questions. And they can sort of achieve knowledge separately and then sort of congregate and share the knowledge they've acquired. For certain questions, though, that doesn't work because asking the process of trying to reach the answer is something you have to go through in order to achieve whatever knowledge you get at the result. That's my understanding. And so I'm wondering why, or if you think that dialogue is always crucial for answering the kinds of philosophical questions that you're most interested in, or if dialogue is really just the key point of it is to elicit inconsistencies that an inquirer might just be too arrogant to admit. So is dialogue sort of a corrective to a lack of humility and maybe an overabundance of conformity? Or is there something more?
Yeah. So a lot of the book is about this question. I would say a full third of the book is about this question. I guess I do want to say dialogue is in some ways essential. I'll temper that point in a few ways at the end of this, but let me sort of say why. I think that sometimes we call something arrogance or what was your other word you used? Beside being too arrogant to admit it.
Well, lack of humility.
Oh yeah, lack of humility. Okay, they're similar.
Conformism.
Conformism, that was the other one, right? Arrogant or conformist. Where those seem like things where it's like, oh well, if somebody willed hard enough, they wouldn't be like that, but we're not all so good, and so we need this corrective. And I think that the problem that Socrates discovered is much deeper and more structural than that. It is that if you think you have the answer to a question, you cannot ask the question. You cannot pose it to yourself. anything that you do would be pretend posing it. Now, something you can do with many questions to which you think you have the answer is suspend judgment, right? So I might think I have the answer to a question, and then I might say, yeah, but I could be wrong about that. Let me suspend judgment about this answer. Okay, so, and then let me inquire into it. Then you can. And so the question is, well, why can't we suspend judgment about these things, about these sorts of questions? And the answer is that, well, we're using that judgment. We're like using it to live, to breathe, to get from one moment to the next. It's structural. It's grounding our lives, and we can't put our lives on hold long enough to inquire, because while we're inquiring, we're still living even at those moments. And so this line of reasoning that I just gave you is not going to apply to every kind of question, right? So an example, the way I introduce this point is like, you might be on your way to the supermarket. And, you know, if someone asks you, how do you get to the supermarket? You would say, oh, follow me, right? You have this answer. You think you have it. It's moving you forward. It's right. But then if you like come up, if they gave you some reason to doubt that you knew where you were, or which way you were going, like what would happen? You would stop. You'd be like, oh, wait, like, let me look at my phone, or let me think about this. The project of going to the supermarket is one that you can arrest. You can put it on hold. But there are projects that we're engaged in where that's not true. And so you know, and a couple different levels, like one level might just be like, if you're a student or if you're a parent or something, it's like, you don't put being a parent on hold. You don't stop caring about your kids when you're doing something else. You're kind of a parent all the time, even when you're inquiring, like, am I a good parent? You can't really ask that and detach yourself from the fact that even at that moment, you're thinking of yourself as a parent, as a parent, and I better be a good one. But there's even something more foundational than parent, something like being a decent person. Everyone thinks that they're basically a decent person. And it's like, how do we know? I mean, did we really check? And you know, what if I was like, well, let me suspend judgment on whether I'm a decent person and examine. It's like during that period of examination, I would have to somehow be living as a potentially non-decent person. And so the thought is that these questions have a kind of practical import for us where we're using the answers. And that means that we're not able to suspend judgment about the answers that we have. What we can do is try to produce those answers for someone else and subject them to examination. The caveat, I said I'd give a caveat. The caveat is that I do think that that when you do this process and you talk to people and they push back on your ideas, whether about untimely questions or about any other kind of question, you start to get a feel for how people challenge you when you say things, and you start to get practiced at it. And in fact, I think this is just what training in philosophy is. So, like if you go to philosophy grad school, what you are being trained in is simulating in your head conversations that you would have with people. So learning to, you're writing a text and you're like, oh, I know how somebody would argue against this. They would give this objection. Well, I'm going to say, you're probably thinking of this objection. Here's my response. And then when I give that response, I'm like, when I give that response, I know what they're going to say in response. And then I put that into it. And that's what it is to write a philosophy paper in a journal. Okay. To write a journal article is to simulate your audience and to be able to respond to their objections. And the way you do that, the reason you can do it is because you had these conversations in your dorm rooms, and then in your classrooms, and then in your grad seminars, and with your professors, and over in writing. And you do get better at it. Like you are able to some degree sort of pretend that you're in a conversation even when you're not in a conversation. But I will tell you that as a professional philosopher who's been to grad school, who's spent, you know, decades like doing all of this, that when I go and give a talk somewhere and I prepared hard for that talk, and I wrote this talk and I simulated the audience in advance in my head, and I'm like, what are their objections going to be? And I tried to put in the responses into the talk, and I give the talk, and then I say, okay, time for questions, and a million hands go up, and like instantly those hands go up so fast, and they come up with problems that I did not anticipate. And every time I'm just like, how did you do it? I tried so hard to make this not happen. And every single time you came up with, like sometimes they're really obvious. They're like, how did I not think about that obvious objection, that obvious worry? Which just shows that even me, a professional who should be really good at this, is actually really bad at it. It's just really, really hard. It's really hard to simulate another mind, and the more attached you are to what it is you're saying, the harder that simulation becomes.
Okay. I mean, I'm also, I mean, I've met you a few times, but I'm also a professional philosopher, and usually I can anticipate what the audience is going to ask beforehand. So I guess, yeah,
Can you anticipate, like, so what percentage of the questions would you say you anticipate?
70.
But then why
70%.
didn't you put those in your talk? Why don't you change your talk to include those things?
Well, because time is limited. I have to make certain decisions about what to include and what not to include, and I can't include everything. So there are certain objections that I will anticipate because I'm simulating, simulating the referee, simulating R1 or whoever the jerk is supposed to be. And it just wouldn't rhetorically make sense to go into all of those questions in the course of the talk, but I can still know that it's a worry someone could have, still come up with the answer, and then have an answer when someone actually raises the question.
And you think, like, I mean, here's a question. So you said 70%. Was that right?
What? Wild guess. I have no idea.
Okay. Right. So even if it's 70%, that's still a lot of anticipating you're not doing, the 30%, right? But also, like, you're kind of choosing, right? I mean, that you have to make choices about what the talk is about. And so you're choosing to have them ask that question. The 70% question is the one you've chosen for that question to show up in the Q&A, right? Because you knew that they would object to it, but you didn't put it in the talk. So that must be the question that you think is, like, the most interesting, right?
Well, I don't address it in the talk because I don't think it's interesting, but I know that other people will think it's interesting. So I have to consider it at some point.
Right. But, like, I mean, to me, it's interesting that, in effect, you have this control. I don't really have this thing. Like, I generally find it hard to predict what people are going to say in response to my talks. But you have this kind of control over what the Q&A is going to be about. And, well, at least, like, it seems like what happens is, like, you got to focus it on this question, the 70% question. And to me, that would be an indication that that's the thing you really want to talk about. But if it's not, then I'm sort of puzzled. I'm puzzled why you didn't focus it somewhere else on whatever it was you most wanted to talk about.
Okay. So
Anyway.
I guess this just brings out, I'm coming to this with a greater confidence in my degrees, in my ability to simulate what the refuter would say about when I'm trying to answer untimely questions. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily going to be the case that dialogue is essential, assuming that I have a well-developed capacity to simulate the objections that the reasonable person is going to ask. But I guess we should maybe move on. So thank you for your response.
No, yeah, great. Thank you. Ajay.
Hi. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Is it okay if I ask a question that's partly about stuff in your book that you didn't talk about? It's closely connected to your exchange.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I want to raise an objection to your treatment of Moore's paradox in the book.
Awesome.
And I guess to set it up a little bit in the context of what you've been talking about, as I understand it, so it's basically a question about how you can doubt your answer to an untimely question enough to like engage in inquiry about it while also still being able to use it like in your life, like for the reasons you were going into with Adam, you have to be able to do that. And as I understand it, roughly your solution is in terms of like the Socratic division of labor, that the other person really does the doubting, but in some way you like have access to the doubt through the other person, like you as reflected in their mind. And you like refer to like Socrates in the Alcibiades, comparing it to like how your reflection shows up in like the pupil of someone else's eye. And so that's like how it's supposed to work. So as I understand it, obviously feel free to correct what I'm getting wrong in your answer, but my objection is that it seems like, so presumably, so the reason this is valuable, it seems like, is that it enables you to engage in like an ongoing process of inquiry. Like you can have one conversation where you realize that you're wrong, but then you can go back to your life, use the answer, still use the answer to the untimely question, but then like go back, like continue to inquire. And it seems like in order for you to like be motivated to continue to inquire, like for Alcibiades to go on meeting with Socrates or whatever it is that you do, you have to have some access, even when you're living your life, to the fact that you know that you're wrong. That is, it can't be the case that it's only when you're in the conversation that you have access to the fact that you know that you're wrong. But if you have access to the fact that you know that you're wrong, like when you're living your life, it seems like that undermines the point of the solution, because like you know you have access to your knowledge that you're wrong while you're supposed to be using the answer that you know that you're wrong about. And so it seems like it would destabilize your ability to live your life. That's like kind of a theoretical thing, but I think there's also just like a certain intuitive confirmation in the portrayal of Alcibiades in the Symposium that you quote at length in the chapter about this. And like he seems to be torn by, like seems to experience being torn like in his life when he's like pursuing power. Like even as he's pursuing power, he still has like the memory of his conversations with Socrates. And that seems like intuitively relatable in the context of his narration of like his history with Socrates.
Yeah. Okay. So I was sort of so my sort of initial response is like, no, you don't have access to the fact that you were refuted later on. That is, it's when you're being refuted that you have access to the fact that you're being refuted, and that's in the conversation. And in fact, it doesn't last that long because Alcibiades regroups pretty fast, and he's like, okay, maybe I don't even care about justice. Maybe I just want to pursue advantage. It's like there's just this sort of moment, but Plato does really highlight that moment for us more than once in the Alcibiades, where Alcibiades basically says, wait a minute, I'm wrong. And one thing I want to do is just for the readers be like, that's an astonishing thing that can happen, that there's space for that to happen in the conversation. Awareness that you are currently wrong, not that you were wrong, right, but you are wrong. And you're right about the mechanics of that, which is that you have some answer to an untimely question. That's your answer. You don't know how to give any other answer, and your life is relying on this. So you have to hold on to this answer, but you can sort of see that your reflected in your interlocutor, you can see that they have good reason for not accepting this answer, right? You're like, yeah, if I were you, I wouldn't accept it either, right? In a sense, reflected in your interlocutor's eyes, you can see the wrongness of your position, that is still your position. And thus you're able, because the interaction is a space that's bigger than one mind, you're able to have this thought, I'm wrong, that you could not have if you were by yourself. That's the idea. But when the Socrates goes away, that poof, it's gone. Now here's the correction that you're making me realize is actually worth making, is like, yeah, but Alcibiades can recall it sometimes. He can recall these moments. And in fact, now we're talking about the symposium, right? What he describes, he's kind of haunted by his memory of these conversations. I think that it's worth sort of emphasizing that there's a really big difference between the memory of being refuted by Socrates and being refuted by Socrates. Alcibiades does not himself respect that difference. So he's like, Alcibiades in the symposium says, like, I know exactly what it would be like right now. I can feel it, even as I'm standing here, right? I can feel it. But then he says what he would be like. He's like, if Socrates were refuting me, tears would be coming out of my eyes. This would be happening, that would be happening. But it's not happening. I mean, he says, I can feel it, but he actually isn't undergoing all those things, right? And so what he has, I think, is what is the word that I talk about in connection with the Protagoras, where when you are weak-willed and you have this feeling like, I know full well that I should actually be doing something else. What you really have is what Socrates calls a phantasma, an image, a representation, right? Like where you're like, you can kind of recall this other state that you're not in, but it doesn't have the force to replace reality. It's not what's really happening. The effect that it has is largely to make you be like, I better stay away from Socrates or I'll get myself into that mess again, right? And so I think that the effect on Alcibiades, you're right, the effect is not nothing. It's not as though those refutations just disappear, but they also don't have their sort of intended effect, which is what's supposed to be the result when Socrates refutes Alcibiades? Well, it's what happens next. He's supposed to inquire. He's supposed to be like, okay, come within a tournament. Like, you don't know, so we're going to inquire. But when what you have is the memory of inquiry instead of the actual the memory of refutation instead of refutation, then the response is run away. So it doesn't have the right oomph.
I guess my worry about it in the context of like your larger argument is like, if what remains when you leave the inquiry, like the inquisitive conversation, is that faint, then like it's hard to see how, like, what would motivate you to continue the inquiry. Because like, as I understand it, the point of solving Moore's paradox in the context of your book is to show like how Socratic inquiry is possible, like how you can both be living your life using the answer to an untimely question, but also inquiring into it. But in order for you to be doing both, not like literally at the same time, but like as activities in the same life that have like some sort of coordination with each other, it seems like you have to have access to like the knowledge that like there's an inquiry to be made, so that like, so the thing that Alcibiades should have done is to like keep meeting with Socrates, but like in order to do that, even while he is like speaking in the Athenian assembly, he has to like have a plan to meet with Socrates later, and in order to do that, he has to like know why that's like a worthwhile thing to do. And it seems like he needs like an access to the experience of being refuted that is like strong enough for that. And like, if you're saying that like his experience of being refuted is so faint that like it can't really get him back to inquiry. It can just like cause him pain. Like then it seems like the refutation of Moore's, or the solution to Moore's paradox, isn't strong enough to like fulfill your goal of like showing how Socratic inquiry is possible.
Well, I'm only trying to show that it's possible, right? So it didn't work with Alcibiades. It worked actually for a little bit with Alcibiades, and then it stopped working. But it didn't fail with everybody, because we had Plato, we had Xenophon, we had a bunch of other people with whom it succeeded more. Now, Alcibiades was a tough case, right? Because the thing that Socrates says to Callicles in the Gorgias applies 1,000 times more to Alcibiades, namely, like when Callicles is starting to become convinced, and he's like, Socrates, like the stuff that you're saying, like these are good arguments, but I'm somehow I find that I'm just like not really convinced. I'm not really moving to your side. Socrates says that's because of the love of the people, Callicles, in your heart. That is, there are all these voices out there. There are these savage commands of the demos that you're listening to all the time, and you can't fully hear what I'm saying because you're listening to something else. Now, Alcibiades was in a better position in the sense that he really listened to Socrates, like in the Alcibiades. He's not hearing the demos that much. Callicles is always hearing the demos, right? But when Alcibiades leaves Socrates, that voice of the demos just becomes deafening for Alcibiades. And so the thing that Socrates is fighting against is really strong. But, all I'm trying to suggest is that something is possible, not that it's likely. Not that it's likely to succeed. It may just be a very weak thing that's mostly going to fail. But, I mean, in a way, the level of success that he had was spectacular. Like the hit rate was like to have like 2 people, I mean, not just 2, because all those people we lost, right? Out of, a city of, maybe there's only 10,000 people or something, right? That a whole generation of writers were writing Socratic dialogues, most of them we lost. Is to say that he really made it stick for a lot of people, and then, made it stick throughout, all the way running through the whole Hellenistic period. In a way, every school except the Epicurean takes Socrates as their mascot, right? So he's managed to kind of get this inquiry to become sustained. He got the ball rolling, and the ball kept rolling. But you're right, like there's maybe a way to put your point is like it's a bit rhetorically bad for my view that I have to illustrate this with Alcibiades, where the thing ends up failing. That's true. And it's like, it would have been nice if the Moore paradox dialogue happened with someone with like Plato instead of with Alcibiades. I would have loved that.
I obviously want to let other people ask questions. I just like make one small point,
Yeah.
and then you can respond or just move on. But it seems significant that like a lot of the success cases are people who seem, I mean, the dialogue's much better than me, but they seem like not just to like respond to a particular dialogue, but they like change their lives. So in a more systematic way. So like Apollodorus, I think in the like beginning of the symposium, he's like identified as like one of these people who just follows Socrates around all the time. And like Plato, insofar as he appears in the dialogues, seems to sort of be portrayed that way, like in the Apology. So it seems like the success cases actually don't like continue in their normal lives, but with like episodic bursts of inquiry. They actually change their lives so that they like inquiry is like the main substance of what they're doing. And like that seems to put pressure on the idea that you can like do inquiry some of the time while also just using the answer.
Oh, I didn't mean to suggest that. Like, that is, I think you can use the answer in inquiry, right? You still have to be using the answer about what kind of person you should be, even while you're inquiring, because you're still a person. But it may well be that like the real way to keep having the answer, but using it is just to be inquiring all the time. I do want to say about people changing their lives that might be a necessary condition. That's not going to be a sufficient condition, because you got someone like Crito, who's clearly like you know, Socrates' lapdog, following him around, etc. But the very end of the Phaedo, you know, he's like, so how should we bury you, Socrates? And Socrates is like, have you been listening at all? Any way you can, if you can find me, because I'm not this thing right here. I've just been arguing that for, right? So it's clear that like, you know, even with Apollodorus, like the whole barefoot thing, whatever, like there's a cult of Socrates, and that's not the same thing as being a philosopher, right? Already Plato is trying to show that to us. I think partly because he wants to be like, look, guys, I'm the real. Socrates had a lot of followers, and then there's me, and it's not the same. And just because somebody goes barefoot or hangs around Socrates all the time, that doesn't mean they really get what he's doing. So even changing your life is not going to be a sufficient condition. But I mean, it is very much consistent with. I take it to be consistent with my story that it might well be necessary.
Thank you. Oh,
Bharat, hi. I can't hear you. I think you're still muted.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Okay. Yeah. So I was curious about what you make of sort of maybe philosophers who are skeptical of the Socratic project. So in the way you describe it and the way you set it up in the book, you have sort of maybe everyday people don't have the time for this, and then maybe even Tolstoy is sort of dismisses the question, which maybe is an interesting disagreement one can have about whether that's a right reading of Tolstoy, because that actually connects with my question, because I would think somebody like who's clearly philosophical, like Wittgenstein or Heidegger, people who are very skeptical of the project of the Socratic way of thinking about philosophy, might think, no, part of the problem is this is an illusion we get into with philosophy. We think we can answer these questions, and that's partly the kind of confusion we fall into. And maybe one of the things we need to do to grow as people is to actually overcome that illusion, not give into it, right? So that would be a kind of a philosopher's response to Plato, to Socrates, of how to not, why not to do that, as opposed to just the everyday people sort of saying, oh, I don't want to do that, right? So one could think that that's maybe what Tolstoy was. One interpretation of Tolstoy could be, like why Wittgenstein loved Tolstoy would be, oh, Tolstoy really tried to do the philosophy of it and then came to see the limits of it, not that he dismissed it in this kind of knee-jerk, instantaneous kind of way, right? So I was curious, what would be your response to that kind of view?
Right. Right. So I think you're right that like when I was describing the part of my book that Robin read, where it's like philosophers go home to their regular lives and are not doing philosophy, some of them would tell the kind of story you're telling. And they would say, look, there's like the unsophisticated, ordinary layman's way of avoiding philosophical questions. And then there's my very intellectually sophisticated, you know, very thoughtful and smart way of, you know, defusing them or curing the sickness or whatever it is we want to call it. And I think from a Socratic point of view, these just are not very different. But that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think like if Socrates were around, he would love to talk to Wittgenstein. Okay, he'd be like, "This is amazing. You can somehow make these questions go away. Show me how to do it. Let's go." So I don't think. I think if you want to know what would Socrates' response to this be, he would want to engage it as a view, as a theory, and he gets people. He interacts with people who do try to push some line like this. So Meno's paradox is a paradox about how this whole project is impossible. It's a contradiction in terms. You can't make progress here. And I think Socrates is like, he's willing to engage that. So like, you know, there's, but I guess I think that if the only way that you could show that a philosophical question didn't need to be answered would be by way of doing philosophy. You could put yourself into a mood where you no longer felt it had to be answered. And maybe that's what Tolstoy succeeded in doing. And Wittgenstein might well have been envious. He's like, I would love to get into that mood. But it was very clear that Wittgenstein didn't get into that mood. That is, he was obsessed by, like, maybe more than anyone has ever been. I mean, as much as he thinks philosophy is like a sickness, and it's like he had a terminal case of philosophy. And
Well, I guess I just well, I
Yeah.
guess I think my thought was that not that one would have to think philosophy is a sickness, but that like say we could substitute other people who are critical like this, like say I'll walk away with this image from this talk of yeah, what would it be like for Socrates and Wittgenstein to have a conversation? That'd be great, right? But one could ask a similar question of like Nietzsche, right? So people
Yeah.
people so yes, Socrates will do whatever he's going to do with these kinds of thinkers who are very different, right?
Yeah.
But they would sort of, I would assume they would push back and say, well, it's not that we're not trying to be philosophical and question our lives, and we're not trying to be condescending to the everyday people. In fact, we might be more on the side of the everyday people because we
yeah.
believe more that there is more to human beings than intellectuality and rational, the Socratic kind of intellectuality, right? So that would be the challenge to your Socratic intellectualism, right? That you're kind of your position is kind of not taking into account the extent to which human life is driven by the unconscious or the other dimensions of our life, which maybe these philosophers were trying to tap into in a way that they felt that Socrates was somehow ignoring. But yeah, right. That's why I was curious. What would your take of why would I guess they don't seem to come into the book. So I was wondering why don't they come into the book, or do they come into the book? I might.
They really don't. I think that no, I think they really they really don't. Very few voices do come into the book other than Socrates. Tolstoy's an exception, but um uh I think though that if we take just Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, and then I think that they both did espouse the view that there's more to life than being an intellectual. I mean, it's kind of a funny thing about both of them because they were both intellectuals. Like, yeah, Wittgenstein tried, he tried to be something other than that. He really had this idea of like, I can, but he was an intellectual very deeply. That's what he was, right? And so was Nietzsche. It's like all they ever were. And so, and I think you're right that they said they empathize. They kind of felt one with the ordinary person, the one who's not an intellectual. And I think about it the other way. I think, that ordinary person can also be an intellectual like you, Wittgenstein, or like you, Nietzsche. That intellectual is not reserved for this character who then identifies with the ordinary person. But anyway, yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I wanted to take one last question from Chinadum because I know he's been waiting for a second question. So let's take that as our last question.
Okay, yeah, so thank you. So I mean, the second question is just something I've been thinking about, and to what we want to move toward. I know, like in the end, we want to sort of move toward the good by being Socratic and asking these questions of what we want our lives to be. One thing I kind of want to ask is sort of like, is there some end to? Is there some theoretical point at which some person can know everything that they need to know about their lives, such that then they can say, okay, not that I can stop asking questions, but like the things I need to know to live a good life, I know them. Or is there no end points to being like to being Socratic? Like, does this just go on forever and ever? And maybe if people die, or maybe like there's some religious people who say, okay, maybe at the end of life in heaven, we're gonna know everything. So is that also, maybe like part B of the question is like, is this some sort of anti-Socratic thing to think about, that in heaven we're gonna know everything, so we don't need to worry about it? But on Earth, kind of like we have to do this stuff, but it never ends on Earth, and and so it's kind of like, at what point do we kind of like get beyond this process?
So, it's not infinite. It doesn't go on forever, but it does go on longer than any of our lifetimes. So there's good news and there's bad news. I think that there has to be an end. So this is a place where I sort of disagree with a lot of philosophers and the way philosophers think about philosophy. So there's many philosophers who think of philosophy as this kind of infinite project where we're just kind of seeking more and more knowledge, and we're sort of ever deepening our knowledge, but there's no like end point of it. I call it the myth of the infinite quest. I don't, as a kind of person who's rooted in the ancient world, I don't think infinite quests make sense. I think a quest is a finite quest. So there has to be something which is such that if you had it, you would know enough. But I think it's a lot. And you know, Socrates saw that he wasn't going to achieve that in his lifetime, and it's unlikely that we will achieve it in our lifetimes. Um, and but I guess I also think there's some amount of, you know, the question Robin asked at the beginning, sort of where do you direct your inquisitive energies? We're not always asking the same question at every point in our lives, right? There's which part of my life is most ripe for being philosophized at a given moment? And if I'm in a romantic crisis, that's going to be the answer to the question right there. And I think that, you know, it's sort of a claim in the book that when you do go some ways to asking questions like, what is it that I want out of love? You make some progress that you can draw on like later in your life. So even if you haven't gotten to the end, you've gotten to something you can use and live better in the light of. And so, you know, that's to say there is real progress and there is variety in that you're not always asking yourself the same question. And there is an endpoint, but the endpoint is not in your life, is not likely to be in your lifetime. Robin, do you have any final words?
Good night, everyone.
Okay, thank you all for coming. And wait, there was a question in that Marcus was asking about where you got your shirt, and I know where you got your shirt. It's a brand called New Works, NOOWORKS. I don't know when they still have them, but okay, thank you guys. Thank you for bearing with us with our late start.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.